In chapter 22, we are dealing with the second aorist active and second aorist middle indicative. And this is a new tense, and yet there's going to be a lot here that is old, because pretty much everything we learned from chapter 21 as it pertained to the imperfect tense is going to apply here. So that's good news. It's always nice when you learn a new chapter of grammar that most everything is old hat, and then there's just one little thing that gets tweaked, and there you've got your new chapter information. And that's what we have here. And the reason is that the second aorist active and middle indicative tenses are secondary tenses. What are secondary tenses? They are tenses that have something attached to them, which is called an augment, and they are what time frame? They are past, exactly. And the aorist is a past tense form. Now, so is the imperfect. So we now have two past tense forms in Greek that we have to contend with. And the difference between these two is the difference in terms of aspect. Now, aspect, as we've talked about before in the past, is it's a difficult concept to grasp, and there are a lot of disagreements among scholars as to how best to understand it and how best to understand the Greek verbal system in light of the concept of aspect. And that is going to be something that we spend time thinking about and wrestling with really for the entirety of our Greek time together, and probably for you for the entirety of your study of the Greek New Testament. And as you meet with commentaries and look at other studies, they're going to make reference to the notion of aspect. And since English doesn't really have an aspectual system embedded in its grammar, it's not something that we're readily able to understand. But let me just put it this way. The two main aspects that we use in English are perfective and imperfective. And this is not to be confused with the tenses that are known as the perfect tenses, like our present perfect and our past perfect. Aspect, which has the labels perfective and imperfective, aren't necessarily the same thing as the tenses that we think of as perfect tenses, or the imperfective aspect isn't necessarily the same as the imperfect tense, because imperfective aspect is used for the present tense as well. Okay, but just in terms of a real quick and dirty way of thinking through these. Perfective aspect portrays action as an unbounded whole. Imperfective aspect portrays action from within as it unfolds through time. Let me give you two examples here. X ate a burger, and X was eating a burger. Okay? We would say that the first sentence is indicating perfective aspect. It's viewing this process of eating really not as a process, but looking at it as a whole action. It's portraying it as a complete action without respect to its beginning or its end, or any procedural characteristics that may have been going on within the action as it was unfolding. We're just thinking about the action in terms of kind of a summary statement of it. That's perfective aspect. Imperfective aspect portrays the action from within as it unfolds through time. And so when I say something like X, stands for any person was eating a burger, then we know that the action started, right? But it makes no comment or portrayal as to its completion, okay? And in that sense, I'm sorry. This should be as a bounded whole, not unbounded. So perfective views the action as a bounded whole. The whole action kind of capped together, right? And so people will describe imperfective aspect as describing or portraying the action as unbounded, okay, because there's no reference made to its ending. So it could be that that this person is still eating a burger, And it may not be the case that the person is still eating the burger, but this verb form tells you nothing about its ending one way or the other, right? So when you think of that, you're supposed to think of the person actually in the process of eating a burger. Whereas if I say somebody ate a burger, you don't necessarily think of them as still eating it in your mind's eye, right? You think of it as an action that was started and ended, and it's a complete act. Okay? Now, in Greek, we use the aorist tense for our past time for perfective aspect semantics. And in Greek, we use the imperfect tense for imperfective aspect semantics as it pertains to verbal forms. Okay? So that's what we're dealing with here in this chapter is aorist forms, past time forms with perfective aspect. The last chapter, chapter 21, we were dealing with past time forms, but with imperfective aspect. Let's talk for a brief moment before we start looking at the forms of the second aorist, active and middle, at the matter of why this tense is called the second aorist. If there is a second aorist, then that would seem to presuppose that there's what? A first aorist. And in fact, you're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. You're right. There is a first aorist. So there are two ways of forming the aorist tense in Greek. And that's really the difference between the first and the second aorist. So I'm going to make some notes over here. The first aorist is what you might think of as the normal or the regular way of forming the aorist tense. Okay? So the normal or the regular way. The second aorist would basically be the irregular way of forming the aorist tense. I'm going to give you some examples in English of something sort of like this, okay? And let's see if you can draw the connections here. If I want to make the past tense in English, okay? How do I form the English past? What do I do to make a verb past tense in English? Okay, my standard pattern is to add ed to any normal present kind of form of the verb, right? So give me some examples.
Burn.
Okay, so burn would be the form I use for present forms, add ed, and I have I burned, you burned, he burned. That's a perfectly good example. Okay, give me another one. Okay, good, walked. So today I walk, present. Yesterday I walked, add ed, and we're home free, right? Okay, another standard pattern for making something past is not to add ed, but just simply to add a d to the end. So can you give me an example of that? Okay, good. So today I complete my Greek studies. Yesterday I completed my Greek studies. Good. All right, so you get the idea. Children learn to form the past tense in their language by basically generalizing rules like this. They hear people referring to actions now with a form, and they hear them referring to those actions performed sometime in the past with adding these sounds, okay? And then they come to new words that they've never heard in the past tense before, and they know how to form them. It's an amazing thing what children can do with language. All right, and then we all laugh when they learn very early the verb eat, and then they want to talk about what they ate yesterday. And what do they say? I eated. Yesterday I eated, the fish. Poor little fish. Now, we all laugh, right? But it's brilliant what they're doing. It's just that they don't know the paradigm, okay? Well, how do I form the past tense of eat? Yeah. I have some more irregular changes. Basically, if you can forget the spelling for a moment, what I've done is I've changed the vowel, haven't I? Just hear the sound. Eat, ate. Eat, ate. The only change is the change of internal vowel, as opposed to a change of the ending. You see? All right. So give me some other examples that use the less regular way of forming the past tense. Okay, good. So I run, I ran. Excellent.
Sing.
Sing. Good. And who knows what the past of sing is? Ah, it's sang. Sang, that's right. Sung is the past participle form. I have sung. Okay? Come, came. See? Come, came, come. All right. So, basically, this is analogous to a second aorist type of formation, right? These regular forms would be analogous to first aorist. Forming aorist with a first aorist pattern, which we'll learn in the next chapter, is really the more common way. And forming aorist with a second aorist pattern is the less common way. Both of them are the same thing in the sense that they're both aorist tenses. Just like in English, whether I use the normal pattern or whether I use the less normal pattern doesn't matter. They're just different ways of forming the same thing called the past tense, right? And so there's no difference in semantics. There's no meaningful difference between how you would translate a first aorist and how you would translate a second aorist. Okay? It's just how you form them. That's the only difference between these two. Now, why did he start with the second aorist? That's counterintuitive, isn't it? The reason he does is that the second aorist uses all of the stuff we've learned from the imperfect. So the second aorist looks more like the imperfect than the first aorist does. And so he's trying to move from the familiar to the less familiar. Okay? So he's going to tackle the aorist tense that is more familiar based on the imperfect similarities, and then go to the less familiar in the next chapter. Okay? All right. Let's take a look at the handout now. Okay? And we'll talk about how the Greek language forms these second aorists. So we'll start with the second aorist active indicative. And so basics here are going to be pretty similar to the imperfect we've learned. The aorist is used for past time and portrays perfective aspect. That is to say, portraying the action as a bounded whole or in summary fashion without reference to the way, let's just say, it unfolds in time. Okay? The way it unfolds in time. Mounce describes the semantics of the aorist as undefined aspect. Undefined aspect. I don't really like that term personally, but that's what he uses, so just be aware. I do like perfective, and that is more linguistically sensitive term. The stem that is used for the second aorist is the aorist active stem. And for the second aorist active indicative, the subject is the agent of the verbal action. He ate, they killed. Okay, so the subject's performing the action here. So what are the components of the form? How are we going to form it? Well, since it's a past tense form, it's an augmented form. It's going to use the augment, and the augment in the indicative signals past time. And because it's past and has an augment, it's considered a secondary tense. Okay? And so it's going to use the secondary endings too, which we'll see. All right, how do we augment? Well, the same way we augmented in the imperfect. If my verb form starts with a consonant, I use an epsilon augment. If it starts with a vowel, then I take the vowel and I lengthen the initial vowel. But let's just review how to do that. If my vowel were an omicron, what would it change to lengthen? It'd be omega. Good. If it were an alpha or an eta, both of these will lengthen the same way. What will they become? I'm sorry, not an alpha or an eta, an alpha or a epsilon. Pardon me, got ahead of myself. I was already thinking of eta. Ah, I just did it. What's wrong with me? Okay, epsilon. Then these become eta. Okay, so we'll see some examples of that here shortly. Okay, the stem that's used is the aorist active stem. Tense formatives. The second aorist uses no tense formatives, and neither does the imperfect. So far, they're going to look really similar. When we get to the first aorist will use the tense formative. It'll use a sigma alpha, just like the future uses a sigma, and it'll be used in the same place. So that's going to be the big difference between the first aorist and the second aorist. Okay, but no tense formative here. My connecting vowels are the same, omicron, epsilon, and my personal endings are the same as the personal endings of the imperfect active indicative. It's a secondary tense, and it's active, so I'm using the secondary active personal endings. Which ones are those? Let me pull that up for you real quick. So our chart here, it's the secondary active ones are these here in the top right-hand corner. Okay? And these are the forms of the imperfect, and the second aorists are going to look very similar to this. So here I'm using a verb from the verb ballo. Ballo means to throw. We've learned ballo before, haven't we? Okay, you throw a ball, B-A-L-L. So ballo. And this is the second aorist, second singular form, ebalis. Ebalis. So notice that I have, first of all, an augment before the stem of the verb. Ball is the aorist active stem. How do we get the present stem? How do we know what the present stem is of any verb form? You go to the lexical form. The lexical form of a verb is always the present active indicative first singular, or it's supposed to be. And you chop off any connecting vowels and personal endings, and you're left with the present stem. So notice that the present stem can be seen from the lexical form, and it's ball with two L's. Notice that my aorist stem for the second aorist verb is ball with one L. So these two stems are actually different from each other, aren't they? All right. Then my connecting vowel, which could be omicron or epsilon, but since I'm using the second singular personal ending, I'm using the epsilon. What's my rule for whether I use omicron or epsilon for connecting vowel? Omicron comes before the letters mu and nu, and epsilon everywhere else. All right, so there you go. Let's just take a look at what these forms will look like from our chart. All right, and this is just like our imperfect chart, except we have a different stem. So let's take a look at the first one. First person singular. We have ebal, the augment, and the stem, the aorist stem. Then we have our connecting vowel, omicron. And remember, the real ending is mu here, right? Only consonants that can come at the end of a word are nu, sigma, and rho. The mu is the real ending, but it gets converted to a nu because mu's can't stand at the end of the word. And so it ends up being ebalon. So instead of ebalam, we get ebalon. That would be I through. I through. On the other hand, for second singular, we have ebal with epsilon sigma. There's no phonetic changes that happen, so we get ebalis. Ebalis. Next, we have ebale with a tau. Remember, mu, sigma, tau are my real endings, but you know taus can't do what? They can't stand at the end of the word. Now, I don't think we talked about this, but I have an expression for what this is called. This is called throwing in the towel. When the tau is at the end of the word, it cannot stay. Greek throws in the tau. Okay, so it's gone. So when the tau drops off, the epsilon is left, and it just stays just like that. So we're left with ebale, ebale. And of course, I could have a movable nu at the end of that. So we'll see that shortly. Okay, first person plural. Men is my personal ending. So ebal, between that and men, I need an omicron for my connecting vowel. And nothing needs to change here. This is a perfectly good form as it stands. So it should be ebalamen. Ebalamen. So do change that accent mark there. Ebalaman. And then on the next one too. Ebalate. So te is my ending. Got an epsilon for my connecting vowel. So ebalate. So we through and y'all through. And then we have ebalant. New tau is my personal ending. And then Greek throws in the tau because it's at the end of the word, and I'm left with ebalon. Ebalon. They through. They through. All right. So let's go to this next little paragraph. This is important, so I'm going to just read it to you. I will not require you to memorize the paradigm for the second aorist active indicative, but you must understand how it's formed so that you can identify, parse, and understand the meaning of these forms when you see them. As you can see from above, being a secondary active tense, the second aorist is in every way identical to the imperfect, except for the choice of the stem. The imperfect always uses the so-called present stem, and the second aorist always uses the aorist stem. Where a verb has a second aorist, its aorist stem will always differ from its present stem so that you can tell the difference between the verb's imperfect and second aorist tense forms. So let's compare these two here. So I have on the imperfect side on the left, ebalon, I was throwing, and compare that with the second aorist of balo, which is ebalon, pronounced exactly the same way but with the single lambda versus the double lambda. That is the only difference. The only difference is in the stem when you have a second aorist. Okay? And that is true all the way. Everywhere else, identical. They're both past tense. They both have augments. They both use secondary active endings. They both use the same connecting vowels. They are the same, except for that stem. And of course, their translation value is different because in the imperfect, we're dealing with the unfolding of the action and through time in the past. And in the aorist, we're portraying the action as a simple, bounded whole. So I was throwing, imperfect, I threw, aorist. Okay? So we will typically use the simple past for our translation of aorist forms. That will be the most common way to use our English tenses to translate. If you go to page 370, you see an appendix that says tense forms of verbs occurring 50 times or more in the New Testament. And then the kind of chart he gives, officially 372 is where the forms begin. You have 6 columns, right? And it's the first column that gives you the lexical form, and what's almost always going to be the present active indicative, first person singular. The second column will give you the future active indicative, first person singular. And the third column will give you the aorist active indicative, first person singular. And so notice with agapao, you have agapesa. You see the augment there? The alpha has augmented to eta. And you have the sigma alpha is your tense formative. So is this a first aorist or a second aorist? It's a first aorist. Good. But look at ago. The third column has agagon. No sigma alpha tense formative. Rather, it's using the same endings as what you saw for the imperfect. Okay? This is a second aorist. So how would you know if a verb is first aorist versus second aorist? You're looking at the end and seeing what kind of formation did it use. All right? Now, my bugaboo with Mounce is that when we're looking at the chart in the back, I can unequivocally say it's the third item. Okay? It's always the third verb form. But when you're looking at Mounce's vocab list at the end of each chapter, I can't always put it that way. Because if we count the lexical item on the left-hand side as the first form, and then in parentheses you've got the imperfect, then you've got the future, and then you've got the aorist, technically it's the fourth verb he gives you in the vocab list. But the fourth verb in the chart is not the aorist, it's the perfect. So anyhow, I really don't like that. And before I married him, I should have talked to him about this. That's a joke, by the way, for anybody who's listening, that when Dr. Marshall disagreed with Dr. Mounce, one of Dr. Marshall's former students, complained that it was like hearing his mom and his dad squabbling. So anyhow, there you go. All right, well, let me stop there.